Good afternoon, everyone. Bom dia, todas e todos. Welcome to this Brazil Crisis webinar, an event organized by Global Canopy and co-hosted by the Oxford Centre for Tropical Forests. This is an extremely popular event. More than 1,400 people have signed up from all over the world and many walks of life, civil rights groups, governments, academics, businesses, and donors. I think this huge interest is a reflection of concern about what's happening in Brazil today. And I think it's an awareness that what happens in Brazil doesn't stay in Brazil. And what happens to Brazil doesn't necessarily start in Brazil. Welcome to all of you. My name is Jonathan Watts. I'm Global Environment Editor of The Guardian. I'm here today in a personal capacity as moderator of this event. I was formerly based in Rio de Janeiro as Latin America correspondent for The Guardian from 2012 until 2017. When I arrived 10 years ago in Brazil, it would be impossible to imagine an event like this focusing on the crises of Brazil. 10 years ago, Brazil's economy had just overtaken the UK's. Deforestation rates had gone down by 80%. Brazil was winning popularity and kudos around the world for its brilliant medical response to the AIDS pandemic. Everything seemed to be going right. Brazil seemed to be a model. Today, how different, how much sadder things look. The crises we are talking about today affect many walks of life, but let's just start with, of course, the COVID crisis. Brazil now with 439,000 dead so far, second only to the USA. That will be a big focus of our discussion today. Amazon deforestation, last year was the worst for a decade. Last month, the rates were up 43% on the same period last year. We're also seeing rising problems of poverty and hunger. We'll discuss those too. And of course, overshadowing it all is the political situation. Brazil's problems don't begin and end with Jair Bolsonaro. He's certainly a part of them. But we are seeing very unstable politics in recent years. And recently we've, for the first time, seen polls saying more people support impeachment of Bolsonaro than are against it. And just today, of course, we've had the federal police raiding the home of Environment Minister Ricardo Salles. So there's a lot to discuss. We're not going to be able to capture everything, but what we do want to do is give more international visibility to the many crises that Brazilians are facing. We also want to pay homage to the Amazon-based photographer Lilo Clareto, much loved, who died from COVID-19 last month. This will also be the international launch of the fundraising campaign Breathe Lilo, which aims to support his family and also to cover the expenses of his hospital treatment. We also want to look at what the UK and international organizations can do to support Brazilians. And this event is also kicking off a series of webinars on Brazil and the Brazilian Amazon that Global Canopy is going to be running ahead of COP26 later this year. Today's event will be 90 minutes. It will last 90 minutes, 60 minutes of panel discussion. We have a very superb panel that I will introduce shortly, and 30 minutes of questions and answers. All of you in the audience will have an opportunity to submit questions. Please do so. You'll see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Use that to submit questions, and we'll try to take some. Obviously, we won't be able to take them all, but we'll try to deal with as many as possible. A couple of other items of housekeeping. This event will have simultaneous interpretation into English and Portuguese. To choose the language you want to listen to, At the bottom of the screen, look at the little planetary globe icon and choose interpretation, then pick your language. You can mute the original audio if you like. So now let me introduce you to our superb lineup of speakers. Well, we will have Sônia Guajajara, who is in another press conference, but will hopefully join us later. Sônia is one of the most important Brazilian indigenous leaders, and she is the coordinator of the Brazilian Articulation of our indigenous people. We also have Adriana Ramos, who is one of Brazil's most respected environmentalists, a member of the Coordination Committee of the Climate Observatory, and she's policy and law coordinator of Instituto Socioambiental. Sadly, Instituto Socioambiental lost Eber Alves, who worked in forest restoration in the Xingu Basin, also from COVID last week. His friends at ISA say he was a seed that became 18 million trees. My condolences, Adriana. We will also, we hope, not right now, but we hope we'll be joined by Douglas Belchior, who is history professor and founder of UniAfro Brazil. He's a member of Brazil's Black Coalition for Rights, and he has led the emergency campaign, There Are Hungry People, to raise funds against the rise of hunger, misery, and violence during COVID-19. We shall also be joined by Eliane Brum, the writer, journalist, and documentary filmmaker with over 40 journalism prizes and honors. She is a columnist for El País and collaborates with The Guardian and The New York Times. Next, we have Erika Berenguer, Senior Research Associate at the Environmental Change Institute of the University of Oxford, member of the Sustainable Amazon Network, composed of researchers of more than 30 institutions in Brazil and abroad, which was created to apply scientific evidence as a way to strengthen sustainability in the Amazon region. Then two who are not Brazilians, J. Griffiths, an award-winning British writer and author of several books, including Wild, An Elemental Journey, Kith, The Riddle of the Childscape, and a new publication, which I heartily recommend, Why Rebel? She's also a member of Extinction Rebellion. Then we have finally Niki Mardas, Executive Director of Global Canopy. Many thanks to Niki, who wasn't here a few minutes ago. Hopefully he's joined us now. Many thanks, Niki, for hosting this event, and many thanks to Krika, Cristiana Fontes, for organizing it. Now, to kick things off, let's start with a homage to Lilo Clareto, the environmentalist, journalist, and incredibly well-loved resident of the Amazonian city of Altamira, who recently died of COVID. We hope that this event today will raise funds for his family. You should see, as I said, a link on how to donate. If you can, please do. So we'll start with a video that is a text written by Eliane Brum, who was Lilo's journalistic partner for 20 years. He took the pictures, she wrote the words, and her homage puts his death in a wider context and gives us something to build on afterwards. So Athena, could you please run the video for everybody?
Desde que Lilo morreu, eu só penso nas borboletas amarelas da Terra do Meio. 50 mil tons de amarelo. Lilo Clareto foi o primeiro repórter fotográfico a documentar a Terra do Meio, na Amazônia. Era o ano de 2004 e os ribeirinhos tinham suas casas e castanhais incendiados pelos grileiros. Quando alcançamos a floresta profunda, os pistoleiros desfilavam pelo rio a bordo de rabetas, barcos a motor, para intimidar as famílias que viviam há mais de 100 anos na floresta, com a floresta, se fazendo floresta também. Nossa reportagem com as fotos de Lilo foi determinante para a criação de uma área de proteção para a floresta e os povos da floresta, que foi chamada de Reserva Extrativista Riozinho do Anfrísio. Lilo e eu nos tornamos uma dupla de repórteres de foto e de texto na Amazônia, 20 anos atrás, ao fazer uma reportagem no território Yanomami. De Amazônia em Amazônia, fomos nos amazonizando também. Em 2017, nos mudamos para Altamira, cidade que é epicentro da destruição da floresta. Desde 2011, nós já documentávamos a destruição provocada pela usina hidrelétrica de Belo Monte no majestoso Rio Xingu. Compreendemos então que numa época de colapso climático, se torna imperativo mudar a concepção do que é centro e do que é a periferia. Numa época de superaquecimento global, a floresta, grande reguladora do clima, é obrigatoriamente um dos centros do mundo e assim deve ser compreendida. Como não basta defender uma ideia, é necessário também vivê-la. Lilo e eu deixamos São Paulo, a maior e financeiramente mais rica cidade do Brasil, para viver em Altamira, no coração da floresta. Passamos então a contar o Brasil e o mundo desde a Amazônia. Lilo, que documentava as tragédias da cidade, as violações de direitos humanos dos povos que foram convertidos em restos nas periferias de São Paulo pela máquina de mastigar gente do capitalismo, converteu-se no fotógrafo da floresta. Lilo documentava o horror, mas tinha um talento muito particular para ver o que mais ninguém via. Nunca documentou uma tragédia sem encontrar nela uma imagem de resistência. Resistência pela delicadeza, resistência pela alegria. Era desse olhar tão singular suas melhores e mais poderosas fotografias. Olhar que seguidamente era capturado pelas crianças, sempre determinadas a redimir o mundo de sua violência. Os olhos de Lilo se fecharam para sempre em 21 de abril desse ano de 2021. E eu e o Brasil nos tornamos amputados do seu olhar. A causa oficial da morte é Covid-19. Mas Lilo não morreu por uma fatalidade. Lilo, assim como quase 500 mil de brasileiras e brasileiros, foi vítima de um plano de extermínio executado por Jair Messias Bolsonaro, o atual presidente do Brasil, ao comprovadamente disseminar o novo coronavírus para produzir o que se chama de imunidade de rebanho. Gado. Lilo, como centenas de milhares de brasileiros, cuja morte comprovadamente poderia ter sido evitada se medidas de prevenção e combate à pandemia tivessem sido tomadas pelo governo central, foi assassinado. Eu soube da morte de Lilo quase ao mesmo tempo em que li a notícia de que nas áreas destruídas da floresta as borboletas perdiam suas cores. Não mais vermelhas, verdes, azuis, laranjas, rosas, púrpuras. Não mais amarelas. As borboletas estão se tornando cinzas para se mimetizar às ruínas da floresta incinerada pelos incêndios criminosos e pela motosserra dos criminosos. Na natureza, se mimetizar é sobreviver. E também as borboletas estão determinadas a sobreviver. Entendam de uma vez. Genocidas como Bolsonaro estão também roubando a cor do mundo. Lilo, ele também tão colorido, virou cinza. Lilo hoje é cinzas. Cinzas que ele pediu que fossem jogadas na terra do meio, junto à revoada das borboletas. Suas fotos nos lembram que um dia o mundo teve mais cores. Suas fotos nos lembram de resistir. Denunciaremos dia após dia o genocida até que o mundo nos escute. E resistiremos. Luto e luta. Lutaremos até que o mundo volte a ter todas as cores.
That was extremely powerful. I'd urge you to look at the message box, which has information on how to donate if you do wish to donate to the campaign for his family. I'd like to thank Fabio Erdos for kindly and voluntarily editing the video, and Louise Hargreaves for the translation of the narration into English. I'd also like us all, just for a very brief moment of silence for Lilo, for Eber Queiroz, for the more than 435,000 people who've died from COVID-19 in Brazil, including a very disproportionately high 1,000 indigenous people. So let's just reflect just for a short time on this before we carry on. Okay, thank you, everybody. Now, obviously, these deaths are not isolated. They are the result of a cascade of problems, many of which we will now start to address in this panel. I'd like to call up the speakers to talk. Please do try to restrict yourselves to 5 minutes each so that there's enough time for everyone and questions and answers afterwards. We had expected Sônia to begin, but I don't see her yet. So Erika, could I ask you to begin? If you could tell us what is if we could start with, let's start with the Amazon forest. Tell us what's happening there, how Brazilian science has been affected by the current government, and what does science currently tell us about the risks of new pandemics coming from the Amazon forest?
Obrigada, John, pela introdução. Eu só preciso de segundo para respirar, porque até esse momento a gente não teve momento para viver nosso luto, né?
Thank you, John, for the introduction. I just need a moment to catch my breath because it's been really powerful, really intense. As a scientist, I have decided to share data with you because this is what academia should and can do, providing data and evidence to civil society and to the government. So I'd like to start by providing data on deforestation, which we all know has increased during the Bolsonaro administration. So you can see here the purple bars showing 2019 and 2020, how deforestation increased from 2018 to 2019. It was such a huge leap that the last time that we saw anything like this was during the 90s. Just to give you an idea of the dimension of this increase, of how much forest was lost between 2018 and 2019, it is about twice the size of the city of Rio de Janeiro, or about twice the size of London. About 10,000 square kilometers that were deforested in 2019, or about 1 million football fields. So, and in 2020, it was even worse. We deforested over 11,000 square kilometers. And actually, there was a decree in Brazil that established that in 2020, we should have only deforested about 4,000 square kilometers. In other words, we failed to abide by our law and by the Paris Agreement. And this means that all this forest that was cut and then burnt, all that carbon that was in the forest, it was released into the atmosphere and has contributed to global climate change. But we also know that deforestation has an impact on rain regimes. So we can see in this map here on the top how much forest has been forested since 2019. And we can see that we have less rain in the south of the Amazon. And we can see that the darker the map, the less rain there has been in this region here. But in a scenario with little governance, we estimate that by 2050, and we are living in this world of no governance, we expect that all this area in red will represent lost forest in the Amazon. And all this area in the map below that is either yellow or orange means that these are areas that will have less rain by 2050. And we're talking about an economic loss of about 190 billion US dollars by 2050. Because Brazilian agribusiness does not rely on irrigation, it relies on rain. But if we have no forest, we have no rain, and there's no agribusiness. So this will have a major impact on the Brazilian economy. In addition to the impact on the rain and the release of greenhouse gases, etc. Another terrible effect of deforestation are the pandemics. So we can see, last year in April, Science magazine actually depicted a picture of a worker working for the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation. And actually this article described how zoonotic diseases, those that can be transmitted from animals to human beings, and how this can increase, as we are seeing now during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, this map from 2017 shows the places in the world with the highest risk of these diseases transmitted from animals to human beings. And again, once again, the Amazon is the epicenter of this. It's the place in the world with the highest number of zoonotic diseases that have not been detected. But we can do something about it because we have science that can do that, that can monitor that. But we know that during the Bolsonaro administration, both in 2019 and 2020, we have invested the least possible in graduate studies and graduate research in Brazil. So we had the highest deforestation rates for the past decade. We have the least investment in research and studies. And as a result, we have this scenario of devastated land. But as we saw in the beautiful video paying homage to Lilo, this is not what we want for our future. We want color again. We managed to reduce deforestation between 2004 and 2018 by a huge proportion during that period. And it's my duty, as of any other scientist, to bring this data and share this data with civil society so that we can reverse this gray scenario that we are facing. And as a Brazilian citizen, it is my duty, and it's the duty of all of us to reverse this devastated land scenario. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Erika. I think that puts things really well in the environmental context, and it makes clear that none of this is inevitable. And you make the link very strongly between what happens to the environment, what happens to the forest, and the risks to human health and well-being. And on that subject, I'd like next to ask Douglas to talk to us about the disproportionate impacts on the Black community in the cities, on quilombolas, more in the countryside. Why are they most affected by the pandemic? And why also, at the same time, are we seeing hunger rising again in Brazil? Douglas.
Muito obrigada pela oportunidade.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. Thanks to everyone for inviting me. My name is Douglas Belchior. I am a Black leader here in the state of São Paulo, and I work toward building a national coalition of human rights and Black people's rights. And I've been engaged politically with the Black community. That many people do not know about it, but we've been working on this for a long time. And we are going through a time when the human rights situation in Brazil is becoming more serious, and we've never seen anything like this. And the Black community in Brazil, together with the native populations in Brazil, or the original peoples, communities in Brazil, they have this tradition, they have this history of having their rights denied. So the Brazilian state, the Brazilian nation, was built on a history of very violent slavery for over 400 years. And as society started organizing itself at the end of the slavery period, let's say modern Brazilian society organize itself with an intention of maintaining those privileges and maintaining the property in the hands of those that descended from colonizers, descended from slave owners. And Brazilian society and all the governments since then have always strived to maintain Black population subjugated, either through violence on one hand, or also because of the very difficult, very harsh well-being or situation in terms of access to rights and to wealth. And we have a history, therefore, about 400 years of violence that affected both indigenous and Black communities. And Black communities are present in all biomes, and they are also responsible for the preservation of biodiversity in Brazil. So Quilombola communities, they're present everywhere, and they actually play a very important role in what we call the legal Amazon. There are about 2,500 Quilombola communities that work directly on that biome. And there's a political organization of those communities when they fight to defend and to protect their rights. For example, when they oppose bills of law that aim to deliver a huge amount of land to private interests, to agribusiness. And these communities openly oppose it, because actually when you talk about Brazilian agribusiness, there's a lot of publicity about how important Brazilian agribusiness is, and because it's so profitable and it's so important for the Brazilian GDP. But actually, agribusiness, rather than being as popular as important, agribusiness means hunger. As a result of the pandemic, but not only as a result of the pandemic, but when you talk about Brazilian poverty, Brazil is becoming poorer, not because of the virus, but because of economic policies that have been implemented by a sequence of different governments that have always privileged those that are richer, and that do not introduce important reforms to ensure that all the population could benefit from the Brazilian wealth. So there's no public policy aimed at supporting the poorer populations. There are ultra-liberal policies that aim to remove rights from the population, economic rights, cultural rights, social rights. And this poorer population are mostly formed by Black people. So there's also this radical racism that affects, or this structural racism that affects Black population in the cities as well, because they are affected by polluted waters and by the lack of drinking water. And this environmental racism has a major impact on Black people living in the cities as well. And the COVID-19 pandemic has radicalized these problems that are permanent and have been present in Brazilian society for a long time. So poverty in Brazil has become more serious, and this virus has arrived. It did arrive in Brazil from overseas through richer people that were traveling, and so therefore the virus arrived from airports. And there's no public policies to protect the health of the poorer population. The Black population, because they have less access to healthcare, they were most severely affected. And when we talk about those nearly 500,000 people that were murdered, we're not even considering what we call under notification, because these are the official figures. But actually, there's a lot more people that lost their lives as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, but they're not included in this statistic. So the Black population are those that die the most, that have least access to healthcare, and have least access to vaccination. And actually, even in this vaccination campaign, when we look at the results, the Black population are having less access to vaccines than the white population. So less than half of the people that have been vaccinated so far are Black. And actually, the majority of the Brazilian population are either Black or mixed race. So as a result of all this, we can see poverty increasing in Brazil and hunger increasing in Brazil. And there's a lot of people that can no longer have 3 meals a day in Brazil. And more than half of the Brazilian population are facing what we call food insecurity. In other words, more than half of the Brazilian population do not know if they'll be able to feed their children tomorrow. So we're living a war scenario. Thousands of that on one side because of a pandemic that was incentivized, that was promoted by the Bolsonaro administration, because Jair Bolsonaro decided not to vaccinate the people, decided not to invest in prevention measures. And actually, this is being investigated. There's a parliamentary inquiry going on at National Congress today to investigate these crimes. But on the other hand, there are millions of people that are suffering hunger and poverty. And that's why the Brazilian Black movement has launched a campaign saying someone is hungry. And if someone is hungry, we should feed them. And this has been inspired by a poem by a very famous Black poet called Solano Trindade, and this campaign aims to collect funds to help lots of people, Black families and families that are not Black, but people who are suffering hunger today in Brazil. So thank you very much, and I'd like to launch an appeal here to international solidarity, and I'd like to show you a video discussing and showing what we're doing in our campaign. I'd like to share that with everyone. Thank you very much.
Tem gente com fome.
Se tem gente com fome, dá de comer.
Sofremos um grande aumento no preço da cesta básica. Só o arroz aumentou 83%. Crianças desnutridas, aumento do desemprego, quase 30 milhões de pessoas vivendo abaixo da linha da pobreza extrema.
Tem gente com fome. Tem gente com fome.
Tem gente com fome. Tem gente com fome.
Tem gente com fome.
Tem gente com fome. Tem gente com fome.
Tem gente com fome.
Tem gente com fome.
Se tem gente com fome,
dai de comer.
Já são 15 milhões de pessoas passando fome no Brasil. Como fazer quarentena para frear o contágio por coronavírus se não tem comida em casa? Faltam políticas para ajudar as pessoas mais pobres a enfrentar a doença e a fome. Não podemos mais esperar. Precisamos de você. Ajude a alimentar famílias que precisam de ajuda em todo o país.
Muita fome. Se tem gente com fome, dá de comer.
dá de comer.
Dá de comer.
Dá-lhe de comer.
Dá 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 de comer.
Tem gente com fome. E se tem gente com fome, dá de comer.
Acesse a página temgentecomfome.com.br e doe quanto puder.
Thank you, Douglas, for that powerful exposition that explained the deep historical roots of structural racism in Brazil, how they've become worse recently, that even though harvests and agribusiness is growing spectacularly in Brazil, at the same time, so is hunger and poverty, which is a horrible indictment of inequality and mismanagement, and how this is making many sectors of the population, especially the Black population, particularly vulnerable to disease, which is, it's got huge social pressures building up there, as well as a horrendous death rate. Thank you very much for that. I'm sure we'll get onto some of those issues later in the question and answer. Next up, I'd like to like to hear from Adriana. Hello, Adriana. I'd like to widen out a little with you, please. You have been involved in sort of civil rights, environment, policy making for a long time, and could you give us an idea of how the Bolsonaro government has impacted the socio-environmental agenda and why this is happening? And perhaps you could also start to look, we can start to address that question of how the international community can help suffering Brazilians at this moment. Over to you, Adriana. Hi.
Olá, John. Muito obrigada. Obrigada, Global Canopy, aos demais parceiros.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you very much to Global Canopy, all the other partners for hosting this very important event. I think what we heard from Erika and Douglas gives you an idea of the challenges that we're facing in Brazil today. And when we look at it from the perspective of social environmental policy, we know that since Bolsonaro was a federal representative, when he was first elected, he already shared with us what his views were on the Amazon and how the protection of the environment and the rights of indigenous people and other traditional communities, how in his point of view, this would go against Brazil's economic interests. And he was the first person, the first deputy to try to introduce a law against the demarcation of indigenous lands. And actually, when he was running for president, he made a promise that he would block all demarcation of indigenous lands, and that he would also stop what he called as the industry of environmental fines. And what he did as president, he promoted the militarization of environmental agencies, the dismantling of inspection rules, and also political persecution against civil servants and environmental leaders. He closed several councils and committees, preventing civil society from participating in the design of public policies, and also introduced projects that would go against the protection of the environment, including actually what he did with regards to the Amazon Fund that prevented Brazil from accessing a huge amount of money, about $500 million to protect the Amazon. And he did that based on criminalization discourse, and actually empowering certain groups such as land grabbers and loggers to do whatever they wanted in the Amazon. And actually he encouraged them not to follow the legislation. So a survey carried out by the Socioambiental Institute last year actually proved there was a clear link between whenever he spoke against the law and actually where the law was being breached. And actually the Federal Supreme Court has authorized the federal police to investigate civil servants and other people that were linked with the dismantling of environmental protection in Brazil, including the Environmental Protection Institute. And among the proposals that he presented, among the bills of law that he introduced in Congress, there are several that aim to alter environmental licensing rules in Brazil and land regularization rules in Brazil. And this is something that's being discussed in Congress at the moment. In addition, the government introduced a bill of law that would enable mining and hydroelectric power plants to be built on indigenous lands. And this is actually very similar to what was done actually during the military regime in Brazil and everything that happened before this new constitution that we had that was approved in 1988. So considering all these negotiations that Brazil has launched recently, trying to engage again in climate change discussions worldwide, this is all based on this weakening of the power of the state and also on the misuse of our land, rural land registry. And actually during the Bolsonaro administration, this registry has been used to actually identify lands that could be used by the private sector, and that could enable private companies to invade and to use public lands. And there's been a huge increase in this grabbing of public territories in Brazil. And because many of these lands, they have irregular registers in this overall Brazilian registry, this actually leads to this invasion and this misuse of public lands and also public forests. So all these actions, changing legislation and making it more precarious, this has incentivized and encouraged the invasion of public lands in the expectation that this invasion might become legal. Well, talking a little bit about how we expect the international community to contribute to Brazil, I think it's fundamental that all international actors are interested in this in Brazil, support Brazilian civil society, contributing with sharing trustworthy or credible information about what's happening in Brazil at the moment. Because as we've been saying, the situation is very serious in Brazil at the moment. We ask you to please help us to identify multilateral, bilateral processes that are going on that could perhaps support Brazil with subsidies and with input, and also to challenge the Brazilian government in international forums so that we can prevent these new policies from being implemented in Brazil. Brazil has a history of very fast progress in the area of environmental protection, but this took place actually with the participation of several different segments of society, including civil society, academia, and other stakeholders. So it's very important that we strengthen the work of local communities so that they can have both independence and the necessary resources to do that. There's a recent report published by the Rainforest Foundation in Norway that proves that those that support, or the organizations that support indigenous management and local management of public lands, they have received a lot less funds and resources during this current administration than they did in the past. And most of these funds actually end up in the hands of multilateral organizations and international organizations. And actually, it's important for everyone to recognize that what we want in terms of forest conservation is what indigenous people and traditional communities have been doing for a long time. And these are the models that we should favor. And everything else has to be considered from this starting point, from the perspective that we must protect the forest in the Amazon. And this actually is completely different from the objectives that this current administration actually promised to achieve. And so what we would like the world to understand is that helping Brazil at the moment means helping Brazilian society. And thank you very much.
Muito obrigado, Adriana.
Thank you very much, Adriana.
Very powerful, very precise, and very clear about how protections have been weakened financially, structurally, in every way. And I think we can point the finger at the government. We could also say that in Congress at the moment, there's 3 very important pieces of proposed legislation that would accelerate this and encourage even more land grabbing. So a really difficult situation right now, but you did see areas where there was reason to be positive, because when civil society is engaged, things can move very quickly. I'm very happy to say Sônia Guajajara has joined us. Bem-vindo, Sônia. You've just arrived, so if it's okay, we'll have one speaker before you, and then you'll be next. But before Sônia, let's hear first from Eliane Brum, who I hope, as a journalist who's been based in the Amazon for a long time, can pull together some of these different threads. It seems like there's this crisis and this crisis and that crisis, but to what extent is it all part of the same crisis? Eliane.
Boa tarde.
So good afternoon. Brazil is under the control of a president that is basically in charge of a termination project. When we say that in relation to COVID-19, Bolsonaro has executed a termination plan, we are not using a historic figure. We are actually stating a fact. Studies from the University of São Paulo for human rights, starting from the analysis of over 3,000 people in 2020, approved the execution of a plan for disseminating the virus to produce the so-called herd immunity. But this plan was actually developed in such a way that Bolsonaro refused the purchase of vaccines, and at the same time when he was spending millions of reais importing chloroquine medication which has no efficacy for COVID-19. It is also critical, and it is very clear that we are not really looking at different problems in Brazil with no connection between them, because when we talk about the plan for disseminating the virus carried out by Bolsonaro and the plan for destroying the Amazon also carried out by Bolsonaro is basically talk about the same plan. The current pandemic, as well as the other pandemics that will come, they are directly linked to the destruction of nature. So the more we destroy the Amazon, more viruses will be released, and the higher will be the risk, the severity, and the frequency of pandemics. Since the election campaign, Bolsonaro made it clear that destroying the forest to increase the stock of land in the market, as well as exploiting commodities, that would be at the core of his administration. He never hid this. He only hides his relationships with the militias who control organized crime in the Rio de Janeiro state. He is very clear about the other things. The genocide attack against the indigenous was already in course before the pandemic, with the weakening of the inspection and environmental legislation. Also the incentive for indigenous lands to be invaded by land grabbers and miners. We have seen Amazon as exploratory area, and the COVID-19 became an unexpected biological weapon to eliminate this barrier, which is the indigenous peoples. Bolsonaro left the indigenous lands open to the virus and the populations without support. His intention, his plan, systematic action is clearly a genocide. And while this genocide moves forward, the Amazon is dangerously reaching the point of no return. The death of the indigenous people, the death of the forest, thus is the same death, and it is part of the same project. When Bolsonaro commits genocide, he is also committing ecocide. And in the case of the non-indigenous, it is important for us to understand that the population that is dying in Brazil is not a generic population. Those who are dying the most, as research shows, are Black people, because the majority of those who are unable to work remotely is made up of Black people. Those who live in precarious homes with no sanitation, where to stay, and those who have less access to health services. And it's also Black people who have become even more impoverished, and thus they are the ones who are most hungry. And it is also the Black people, and especially Black women, who are most affected by the ongoing climate collapse, in course of which the pandemic is a symptom, and the ongoing climate collapse is directly related to the destructions of regions on the planet like the Amazon. Once more, what I want to make clear here is that it is not really about one thing or the other. We are talking about the same ecocidal project. This is what we refer to as Brazil was founded on the bodies of the indigenous people and Black people. But indigenous and Black people, they are not the only great historical victims of the process that converted nature into merchandise and people into cheap meat, a process that caused the climate collapse. more than victims, indigenous and Black people in Brazil, they constitute a monumental movement of resistance. Indigenous people have resisted all forms of extermination for more than 5 centuries, and Black people have done so for over 4 centuries. Hence, it is necessary to understand the genocidal plan executed by Bolsonaro as an attack on the resistance forces that defend another type of being and being in this world, with all others, human and unhuman. Bolsonaro's genocidal plan is an attack on the forces of resistance that defend a new type of society and relationship with nature. This is the magnitude of what we're facing. By converting Brazil into a breeding ground for new variants of the coronavirus, by destroying climate, regulating forest, by exterminating resistance to the socio-economic model that destroys the planet, Bolsonaro threatens us all. The question I ask is, what are we going to do to stop Bolsonaro? Thank you.
Many thanks, Eliane, for connecting everything together: ecocide, genocide, an attack on resistance, an attack on efforts to find a new relationship with nature. I think that brings us very well to our last Brazilian speaker, Sônia Guajajara, the head of APIB. Sônia, welcome. Lovely to see you. Please, can you tell us what's the latest situation for indigenous people in Brazil and how they've been affected under the Bolsonaro government, both by policy but also by COVID?
Olá, gente. Boa tarde.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be here with you. What we are facing, which is, not recent at all, but something that has become more drastic in the Bolsonaro administration, is this attack and this attempt of shutting up the voices of those fighting for life. Us, from the Terra Livre in 2021, we have brought a theme that our fight is still for life. It's not just against the virus. So in this moment that we face currently, we have many different viruses that are interconnected. So we have bullets that come from all over the place, and they come to those who fight to defend rights, the environment, those who fight against deforestation, against fires, against human rights violations. So these are the many viruses that currently add to the pandemic virus, the novel coronavirus. Bolsonaro has left the territories open, as it was said by our colleague, for the virus to come in. And with this, he killed over 1,000 people in the country. And this contaminated over 65,000 indigenous peoples. And the Amazon region was the region that had the most aggravated situation. So we have over 165 peoples that have been affected, which represents half of the indigenous peoples in the country. And all of these deaths, we know that they could have been avoided if there was a commitment, proper, appropriate health services, and more recently this year with better vaccination, where we could perhaps prepare the clarification for indigenous people to be vaccinated, and also for indigenous people living in non-demarcated areas. It is important to mention that through the PE 709 in the Supreme Court, indigenous people were included as a priority group, and they received the vaccine in the first moment. But then the federal government submitted a national vaccination plan that left half of the indigenous people out of it. So 42% of the indigenous peoples in Brazil the indigenous population in Brazil, they are not part of this priority group. So once more, we appealed to the Supreme Court to ensure vaccination for everyone. The Supreme Federal Court established that the government used extraordinary resources to service the indigenous who are not in treated areas. And the government questioned this because they do not want to provide for the indigenous people. So this really only shows that he wants to restrict the indigenous population, ensuring that there are only half of them. So we are currently around 900,000 indigenous people, as per the IBG census, and they're working with a figure of 410,000 indigenous people. So this pandemic has really clearly shown how much the government has this plan to reduce the indigenous population, and with this, reduce access to public policies. And then we continue with this persecution that comes from FUNAI, which is the body, the agency that should protect the people promoting our rights. No, they are promoting measures to persecute indigenous organizations, leaders, criminalizing the partner organizations and entities of indigenous people. So this is a very clear situation where we have attack, persecution, criminalization, and all coordinated within the government. And this hate speech, this hate campaign that has been ran in Brazil by the government agencies that has really aggravated these practices of invasion, violence, and racism against indigenous people. So it's not really just a virus. We have many different viruses that we need to fight against at the moment. And the first is to finish and be able to eliminate this virus and the federal administration, because the political setting at the moment only aggravates all of these conflicts. I like to finish by reminding everyone of what is happening in Yanomami territory, with miners invading, carrying machine guns. They take tear gas. They attack the indigenous peoples. They attack women, children. And we have information of 2 children that have been found dead as a result of this conflict. And this situation is historical. This invasion takes place and has taken place for a long time, but now it has aggravated because they are backed up by this federal government. It's as if they're authorized by the federal government. And then when the president says that he's going to visit the Yanomami territory, he said this in the last 2 days, he states that he's not going to punish the invaders, the artisanal miners. He's going there to be able to protect these invaders and actually work to enact the legalization of mining exploration there. So we have many different draft bills that the federal Congress trying to legalize this, finishing the whole sort of licensing, pre-licensing necessary requirements they need to get. So basically, again, there are many viruses, and only together are we going to be able to face them effectively. And I'm going to finish with my fingers crossed that hopefully the federal police operation started against the Ministry of the Environment today, that it does indeed lead to positive, favorable results to our fight and to the defense of the environment.
Thank you so much, Sônia. Muito obrigado pela sua muito importante mensagem.
For your very important message.
I think you've put the historical context very well, but disease and invasions and killings, especially now tragically with what we're hearing in the Yanomami area, these aren't new. These have been going on for hundreds of years, but in fact, there is an upsurge now when you have a president openly, or at least tacitly, encouraging these sorts of things. So a really desperate situation. I know you have, APIB has a video that conveys their situation. So Athena, would it be possible to see that video?
An attack on the indigenous people is an attack on Earth itself. So the indigenous fight is a fight for life, for the despised lives by the power of the state, for the lives saved by solidarity, lives we've lost, and all kinds of lives we stand to protect. And during the pandemic of COVID-19, once again, our lives became targets of new attacks and persecutions. We lost our elderly, the guardians of our memories and history, the guardians of our knowledge, of our songs, prayers, and spirituality. This isn't just a flu. For Bolsonaro's government, this is a tool of extermination. The pandemic became another regime's weapon for the ongoing genocide and ecocide. But our people decided not to die and fight tirelessly in defense of life. In front of fear, terror, and our own death, we recreated hope. Our ancestry is millennial. We fight, resist, and carry on, alive, dreaming, with different worlds. We will survive standing on our earth's soil, which is our blood, our flesh, and our spirit. This is present in each corner of all Brazilian territories. We won't give up recreating our worlds to continue our existence. We won't give up living. We won't give up living. We won't give up living. Indigenous blood, not a single drop more.
Another very powerful and important video, Indigenous blood, not a drop more. Thank you again, Sônia and APIB. I think we will return to that, I hope, in the question and answer. Yes. Now let's just hear from Niki Mardas of Global Canopy. Hi, Niki. I'd like you, if possible, to step back and put this in a bit of global context. This isn't happening in a vacuum. What's happening in Brazil has never happened in a vacuum. It's partly driven by global market forces, deforestation, and of course now we're seeing vacuum limits on vaccination, inequality. All of these things are connected to the global markets. And there's also, though, I suppose, more awareness in the outside world of what is happening, and you are seeing efforts by supermarkets and consumers to try and do something. But is this happening at the speed needed to change to tackle this, the crises that we're seeing? So if you could make the link internationally with what we're seeing there in Brazil and what the rest of us.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you to everyone. It's been unbelievably moving and overawing to hear these testimonies, and from the start through the work of Lilo Clareto, as Eliane Brum held our hands through that with her poetry. And it's underlines, I think, the need for a testimony of diverse voices in what is such a diverse set of intertwined crises. And even for someone like me who thinks about these issues every day, this has been revelatory, let alone the political processes, the global discourse into which all of these voices need to be brought and sown, so that we're not just talking about tons of carbon, we're not just talking about hectares of forest, but we're asking the question in the international landscape that you asked about, John, that Eliane posed, what is center, what is periphery? And to take the invitation that we've heard today from many of the speakers to look at the world from the Amazon. And it's a year of high politics for the climate, for nature, and it couldn't be more important in that context. And yeah, you ask about the linkages. 2/3 of deforestation driven by agricultural expansion for commodities, a handful of commodities. From Brazil, we're talking about exports of cattle, we're talking about exports of soy, which is then used in animal feed and ends up in over 50% of the products in our supermarkets as a result. And the two biggest markets are by far China, the biggest, and Europe, where I am now. And in Europe, we are seeing some leadership. We are seeing these issues being taken seriously by some leading voices in the private sector. We had 40 UK supermarkets or food businesses calling on the Brazilian legislature just this month to reject a law that's been referenced, the proposed law, essentially legalizing private occupation of public lands, land grabbing. But overall, despite that leadership, overall, the response is weak if you look structurally. And our Forest 500, we have an analysis of 500 big companies connected to deforestation through their supply chains and their investments. And if you look at that, you see that action reporting is weak across the market. So there are leaders, but really structurally, not enough is being done. And even more so, if you look at the finance sector, our report shows that 2/3 of the biggest financiers of deforestation, including in Brazil, are taking no action. $2.7 trillion in investment and lending to high-risk sectors by financiers with no policies at all on deforestation and the other harms it brings. So what we need is ultimately legislation. It's encouraging that in the EU in particular and the UK now, we're seeing some moves towards requirements to report by companies, due diligence, and other legal measures. That's critical in leveling the playing field. And it's encouraging that that's getting some private sector support as well. But really to work, these measures have to come with incentives and support and be in partnership with forest countries. And you can't get away from the fact that partnership with Bolsonaro's Brazil is near impossible, because you hear, well, for all the reasons that we've heard, we don't need to go into the reasons. So all the more reason why new partners must be found, alternative partners. We've heard that from so many today, to support other voices in society, to support states to move forward, because no time can be wasted. And, you know, I'll just end by mentioning China, the biggest market. I mean, China needs to come to the table more actively. That's for sure. There are green shoots there. There are some commitments by big Chinese companies, but so much more needs to be done. And Kunming, we talk a lot about the COP in Glasgow, but there's an equally big summit in Kunming of the Biodiversity Summit this year, a chance for China to lead, a chance to come into alignment with other countries around both the nature and climate summits and send a concerted message from the whole international community as one, because there is no solution to either the climate or the nature crises without a solution to deforestation. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Niki. You've raised some very important points there. And I think that what really stood out to me was I wish we could have a webinar where we would have a lot of Chinese participants, Chinese corporate people, Chinese government people, and a chance to, you know, Sônia Guajajara and Erika and Eliane and Adriana to talk to them directly, because I don't see these forums enough, and I think that could make a difference. And similarly, you mentioned finance, and you know, the divestment campaign in climate terms has been really successful. And I think that's a point of leverage that hasn't been used so much in biodiversity and deforestation. And again, maybe there could be a webinar with big finance leaders and again, these people talking for the forest, so that the Amazon is the center and these people are the periphery, trying to save the center so that everyone is saved. Anyway, some thoughts to go away with there, and we'll address these a little bit more. But as our last speaker with a set piece, sorry, we're a bit behind schedule, but Jay, I think you're a great person to sort of sum up things in a way. You're a writer. You're also, in some ways, you kind of represent many people in our audience who might have been to Brazil, who care about Brazil, who are worried about what's happening in the Amazon. But you know, how would you encourage positive emotional engagement and turning that emotional engagement into something concrete? Into an effective mobilization. I'd love to hear from you on that, please.
I think the first thing that what I really want to talk about is the way that the kind of the deforestation that we're seeing as a kind of deforestation of the human mind. I really want to pay tribute. What a fantastic webinar this is, and so moving and so important. For me, one of the contexts that to bring in the issue of the pandemic is some of the qualities of human nature, the best of those qualities: kindness, concern, and humanity. But the countries that have suffered the most, the USA, Brazil, the UK, and indeed now India, had leaders who are capable of the opposite qualities. So where humility was needed to act with care and caution, they were reckless. Where compassion was required to protect the vulnerable, they responded with carelessness and cruelty. Where a respect for limitation was necessary, like wearing masks and obeying lockdown, they showed this contemptuous and libertarian desire to be free of such fetters. It isn't a matter of personalities, but of politics. This is the politics of cruelty that we're seeing all around the world. This far-right libertarianism, or in Bolsonaro's case, the genocidal fascism, it hates certain qualities. It hates the qualities of humility, of compassion, or truth. These are the fettered emotions because we are bound to tell the truth. We are tied by respect. We're linked to others by love. We're restrained by a sense of justice and conscience. And this is why the COVID crisis is conceptually linked to the climate and ecological crisis, and indeed with the crisis of the human mind. In refusing to be shackled by cuts in carbon emissions, in this demand to be free to fly, in a drive towards unfettered capitalism, it's as if this particularly modern form of fascism demands to be free of the past and loosed from all ties to the natural world. Indigenous cultures are completely opposed to those concepts. The past, say so many Indigenous people, is under our feet. The ancestors, both the animal and human, are there. Yesterday matters, this long time perspective, and indeed with the climate crisis, the long perspective into the future. When I think about the long view, for me, it's like a long way forward, but it's also a long way back. And when I look a long way back, what I really see is that the dominant culture is very, very recent, and it's very, very peculiar. And I'm talking not just about how a society acts, but also how it thinks. And what is needed now is something very new and also very old. It's a necessity to learn to think with beauty and dignity, and actually with wisdom. And I think it's really interesting that in this era, in the last kind of 20 years or so, how so many people have turned towards Indigenous wisdom, looking for what Indigenous cultures have long known, that the earth is sacred, that it gives life. This view, this kind of, I don't want to generalize, obviously, and say all Indigenous cultures are the same, but there are so many things which are so common in Indigenous cultures. This sense of pluralism, of insight, that sense of living in a metaphoric relationship to the world, to be able, as that beautiful film of Lilo Claretta shows, to Amazonize oneself, to become the Amazon, to become another. This kind of sense of metaphor is the treasure of the forests, and the opposite is this kind of literal sense of profiteering and the economics as the kind of, the Bolsonaro idea of what you can take from the forests. I would say this kind of shamanic worldview, it is actually the worldview of all of us. It is our first spirituality. If you take the human mind, you lean it up against the green world, what do you get? Shamanism. And at the heart of the forests, that's where that kind of thinking thrives, in the earth dreams and the night thoughts of forest life. So deforestation is the deforestation of the human mind. This kind of language that I'm talking about, I know that it seems very strange in many ways to kind of, to some of the definitive and actualized thinking of the world, but it's so important to step across the borders, to take on new, different ways of seeing. It's a stance of the psyche, it's a way of understanding the world of spirit and imagination, to put yourself in other people's shoes. these are the attitudes that work in the human mind, like anti-fascism, and it is a politics of kindness. From that, I would say, from that deep, deep sense comes all the practical things. That is why I'm willing to get arrested for Extinction Rebellion. That is why I will join in all the protests for Indigenous cultures and for those ways of thinking that we have to protect, all of us. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Jay. Yeah, and you make the deforestation of the mind, and the video we saw, the decoloration of our sensory experience is also happening. We've heard of ecocide and genocide, and destruction is what we're up against, and what we need to build. What we're hearing is something that's more living, more about life, more about color and variety. Time is sadly very short, and we have a whole bunch of questions that we're unfortunately not going to be able to answer all of them. I'll try and convey some of the ones you've asked, but perhaps the question that's come up a lot from several people is, what can we do? Is what can people listening here do? Donors, governments, consumers, people in other countries who want to help. And I'd like to ask all of you this question, and if it's possible for you to sort of summarize it as tightly as possible, so that it could be a starting point for other people to consider how to help. So let's start with Eliane.
I believe that the Amazon must be treated as what it really is, one of the centers of the world. That means putting it at the center. That means putting other thoughts and other languages at the center. It means all those other languages and ideas that have always been treated as subhuman, such as indigenous peoples and Black peoples and their ideas and languages.
Thank you, Eliane. Douglas?
Sim. Bom, a comunidade internacional.
Well, the international community, what we need is international support and repercussion, and we need to be present and heard in international fora. We are fully convinced that the Brazilian genocide, as it has been denounced by many others in the 1950s, for example, by Nascimento, who denounced to the whole world what was happening in Brazil. So what we need now is that the rest of the world support us in talking to the local press and the local parliament, and tell everyone about this genocidal project that is taking place in Brazil. It's a historical project. The Brazilian state has a genocidal nature, but we now have a government that's taking that to the most extreme levels. And what we need now is this policy design that directly affects indigenous and Black communities. And we need support from the rest of the world to fight this and to protect these communities against what's being done. Because these peoples, these communities, they have a project for Brazil, they have a project for the future. And we need then to oppose this logic of death with the logic of life. And this is what we need.
Thank you, Douglas. Sônia.
Well, to fight the deforestation of the mind, I would like to share this idea of reforesting our minds. So in August, we'll launch this initiative about reforesting our minds, reforesting our ideas, and thus reforest our territories. And the world must understand that we are not a problem, we are part of the solution. Thank you very much.
Absolutely fantastic. Adriana.
Bom, eu acho que a primeira coisa é apoiar.
Well, I think that the first thing that the rest of the world could do to help us is to support these campaigns that were presented here today, support these peoples and communities, and understand that although we had many other administrations that were neglectful of the environment and the Amazon, there's nothing compared to what's going on at the moment, which is deep destruction of people's rights, including denying their right to life. So there's no way that we could ever compare what's happening now with whatever happened in the past. And it's fundamental that people understand this, and that this understanding be shared and be discussed in different fora, different international fora, so that Brazil could have the resources and proper support to overcome what's going on at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana, and particularly important with COP meetings in Glasgow, in Kunming, with Joe Biden arranging summits. It can't just be the government. It has to be indigenous groups. It has to be quilombolas, community groups, human rights groups. Otherwise, the Amazon will not be represented. It will be Sao Paulo and Brasilia. Erika.
É a minha sentença, na verdade, na linha de todo mundo.
Well, my one-line answer is similar to what everyone else has said, to put Brazilians at the center, the Brazilian society at the center, to make us protagonists again. I, as a Brazilian person who does not live in Brazil, I am tired of hearing from other people that my thoughts are with you. Well, their feelings and thoughts are not going to save anyone. Your feelings and thoughts are not going to feed anyone. I want actions. I want to be a protagonist of our lives, of our country, and I want your help with actions. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Niki.
Thank you very much. Erika, thank you for that last invocation. We all need to take action, and it's so easy. I'll maybe speak to some people here who are listening from Europe and who do feel less connected and disempowered. You're not disempowered. Speak as voters to your governments, speak to your banks that hold your money, speak to where you buy your produce from, and ask a simple but powerful question. Is my money driving deforestation? You have a right to know that. It's a simple question. It's a powerful question. But don't just ask that. Ask about the intertwined crisis. Is it driving impacts on people's rights, on people's livelihoods? Because we've heard today that they are all entwined. These are huge and entwined crises. And I agree that we all have a role to play. We can all take action. Really, there's no excuse. And for our part, we will continue to arrange events like these to get voices heard as much as we can help into the center of these discussions. And I would ask everyone that's here today to join more of these as we have them. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot. You and Erika, sorry, I didn't say thank you. Just trying to hurry things along. Jay.
Yes, I think just to be fairly brief, I would say that there are plenty of countries in the world where if you kind of take action and you actually go to the streets, you risk being killed. So I'd say if people are lucky enough to live in countries where you can protest and where the worst that will happen is that you are arrested, I would say this, the times we're living in demand that we take action, and the part of that action is indeed speech, but part of it is to put ourselves on the line. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, everyone. There are a great deal more questions. I wish I could ask them all. There are some great comments in the chat. And anybody who wants a bit more, there's some really good suggestions in the chat about what people can do. There's some really good questions, really good approaches. There's a lot of links in the chat. That's a whole separate body of really useful information that's been generated by this event. But we have come to the end of our time. I'd wrap things up just again with a little bit of housekeeping. For all of you watching, there will be a short survey on the web browser after the webinar, and it'll be really useful to have your feedback. Again, I would emphasize, please do participate or contribute to the Respira Lilo, the Breathe Lilo campaign. You'll find the details in the chat box. I'd like to thank everyone for their participation, the speakers, the audience, really people behind the scenes, Tom Espli, Christiane Fontes, Erika, Athena, McCallum, Daisy Payne, who did incredible work for several weeks from this. I'd like to thank the interpreters, Louise, Chris and Antonio, who've done an amazing job from what I could hear. Special thanks to Global Canopy and the Oxford Centre for Tropical Forests for hosting this event. And please do remember that Global Canopy, this is for them the first in a series of webinars on Brazil and the Brazilian Amazon that they will be running up towards COP26. So do tune in for this. The other thing that I would stress is that there will be a recording available of this webinar. Not straight away, I think it's several days or possibly even a week, but do look out for that. That will appear, and you can go back, because there's a lot to digest in here. There's a lot of very powerful emotions, a lot of brilliant thoughts and great suggestions of where we can go next. Brazil does face a series of unprecedented crises. Those crises do affect the rest of the world. There can be no solution without the Amazon. But we've also heard, there are some completely brilliant people, inspired, passionate, brave people in Brazil. And if we can support them, then I think we're moving in the right direction. So, a lot of them are here today. A lot of ideas are here today. And I hope this is a starting point for some really positive change. Thank you all very much for joining us. And yeah, have a great rest of your days. Thank you.